Hello everyone, Santi here with more Let's Make a Game Astral Collision. There's been a lot of stuff this week, so much so that I'm a little uncertain exactly where to start. So I'll just start by talking about why there's been so much this week. I ended up spending a good bit of time playtesting the game, particularly on... so I usually work on this most concentratedly. It can shift a little bit, but Thursdays and Fridays are when I try to focus on working on this. And I spent a lot of time playtesting on Thursday, which meant that I was running into a lot of stuff, looking at the volumes here. And I'll lower this one a bit. A lot. So I was looking, or I was doing a lot of playtesting, and that led me to some very important conclusions. So let's go ahead and start with a few more straightforward conclusions from this. I did actually end up doing my tweaks for skills, so that's, I guess, kind of the first one. There'll probably need to be more as I figure out what's going on, but I ended up with the knight. I moved interception to be one of the first skills that the knight gets, and you'll notice leader strike here is a new skill. Leader strike is, if I go to skills and I go to knight, leader strike is an attack that hits for some additional plus damage. It is more likely to be a critical hit, and if it is a critical hit, it buffs some random stat for all allies for 3 turns. That's what this does. The whammo is been rearranged a bit. Opening strike is now early, then it gets power attack, and guardian is also fairly early. Shake it off is now an earlier skill as well. I think I rearranged the order of some stuff here. And moved commendation much later. Shake it off is just really useful to have early because there's so much poison early in the game, and so getting it so soon is very useful. The Telenergist, I moved Siphon MP to be one of the first skills that you get. This is really useful for trying to control some of the enemies, particularly the Harrowers that you encounter early in the game. So those are the plant monsters that like to use Sickening Soil and do damage and poison everybody. Draining their MP with this can be a good way of trying to mitigate it, but then you're competing with MP burn, so it gives kind of that flavor there. I ended up moving Meditate a bit later. Still very useful skill to have, but I like it there. Balance MP also has been a little finicky. Returning a negative value meant it didn't do anything, so I've added code to compensate for that. Specifically for reference, balance MP right here. There's a long stretch of code, but right here, if I make the total negative that I'm trying to return, I need to actually straight up tell B to gain that total rather than just delivering it at the end here, because it would be like, oh, you're doing an MP recover with a negative value. Well, that's not MP damage, so we're just going to make it 0 because that's clearly a mistake. Like, well, that's not exactly what I want to do. I could go into the code and change it, but in general principle, I would like it to do that, so I'm going to kind of leave it there. And then Prism Mage, did I do a whole lot here? I tweaked Brilliant Flash, so this is one of the things that I've been doing a lot. Brilliant Flash, I need to scroll to where the Prism Mage is, because it's right here. Brilliant Flash, I dramatically decreased the amount of damage it deals. I dramatically increased its blind rate. So it used to be like a 10% chance of inflicting blind, it's now 50-50. And I also dramatically lowered the MP costs, that way it's more readily usable. Speaking of which, I moved Lightning Bolt much, much later well, not a lot later, but I moved it later in the Sorcerer and gave a new skill called Enervating Bolt, which does a lot less damage, and has a chance to be a critical hit, which gains you MP equal to your level. This means this is a much more spammable skill, and it has this cool side property. I think something that's going to be a general theme here for the Sorcerer is having spells that can critical hit for bonus effects, and this one is an MP refund, which I quite like. So we've covered that one as well. I've not done a whole lot here with the War Mage in terms of skills. I may or may not tweak that one. Yeah, so right here I need to actually update this display. I moved Flash Freeze later because Flash Freeze, for reference, was a very... like, it's not a ton of damage, but it makes all the enemies sleep, which is very powerful. And it's a lot of MP to reflect that. And I kind of like, I don't quite like that. So I made a new skill called Ice Spike, which is a bit more damaging. I'm going to actually, before I talk about what it does, update this display here. We're going all well on the recording. Looks like it. So Ice Spike does damage, and it also has a property where it makes the enemy lose TP. So this is something that can help control the TP of an enemy. You can see it's only 10 MP. I'm trying to keep a lot of these early spells that you're getting like 10 or less TP because I want the usability that comes with that. Because remember, early game you don't have as much MP, especially most classes. Some of them have more MP, like the Telenergist has a lot of MP. That's kind of its thing. But most of the classes here just do not have a ton of MP. The Warlock is particularly low on maximum MP, but has really good MP regen. So anyway, I want to keep sort of these, what I'd call standard spells, lower. I also discovered a very critical thing here, which is that I had utterly failed to include the plugin for state types. So things weren't working, and I figured that out, and I had to add that. That's not a particularly notable thing in terms of what I had to do for it, but it is notable that I had forgotten it and needed to add it back in. But Ice Spike allows you to potentially mitigate enemies' ability to use certain skills. Draining Dark's more or less the same. Ah, yes. I gave... So, Restore Vigor is a fairly strongish heal. It does a decent job of it, but you'll notice some of its value is its ability to remove debuffs. And it's also a good bit of MP to kind of reflect that. So, I wanted to move this later because this is not exactly what I want for like your standard spammable skill. Like, this is not an initial skill, is kind of what it comes down to. Not without the other initial skill being a useful attack skill, and I think it might be... what did I give her? Stone Volley. So Stone Volley early is not obviously an offensive one, and then you get Gust, so it's like I wanted something that could be a useful single target spell. So there's no debuffs early game. It's not something that is an effect that's really happening that enemies do. There certainly will be later in the game, though. So this will be useful a bit later, but not necessarily right away. And so I wanted to make the first skill one that does damage. So this now does life damage to the target. And there's a 15% chance that it will cause Fascination. And it also has a critical property. And if it does, it heals allies for some additional amount. So I've added this function right here, heal allies, which takes who you are and some additional properties. Now, I do need to go into this function, and it's one that I've added here. There's a bunch of other things that I've done that I'll go over shortly. Let's see. This will be quicker if I just go search heal allies. Yeah, right here. So this right here just goes through, hey, what are your friend units? Let's iterate through them. Let's evaluate our healing formula and gain you that HP. Now, there are a couple of things that this needs to do here. Not the least of which is if b dot is state affected 1 equal to false. I need to double check to see if this... Whoa, that was an aggressive tab in. I need to double check to make sure I've gotten everything correct here and that this works. I'll do that off camera probably. But this could actually resurrect allies. And I don't want that behavior. So what would happen is, because I had in testing, I had an ally die. And then I used this on an enemy. It got the effect off. And the enemy... or the dead ally was resurrected with minimal HP based off of this, because that's resurrection, right? The normal way that the game restricts you from casting healing spells on resurrected allies is that the scope of allies will not target dead allies unless you specifically tell it to only target dead allies. So because of that, the skill here, because I was not checking are they dead or not, it could actually resurrect allies. And I don't want that to happen for a couple of reasons. One of which is that may not be how you want to resurrect an ally. Resurrecting an ally with minimal HP ain't great, but the other thing is it just kind of... It's an interesting bit of functionality, but I don't think it's best for the play. I think having to use dedicated resurrection skills makes for better play. Yeah, that's kind of where that settles. Okay, so moving on. We have the special forces. I've done a significant set of rearrangements here. This is actually called Prepare for Battle rather than Prepared for Battle, mostly because it fits better. So I moved some of these things around. Notably, I moved Throat Chop super early because Battle Focus, which raised 2 of your stats, is a skill that I wanted to be careful how many buff effects I'm using early. Prepare for Battle is a very strong, useful buff that really helps your damage and works super well with target weakness when you get it in a couple levels. But Throat Chop is very handy because it silences whatever you hit with it, such as, for example, plants that might want to use the Harrow ability or the Sickening Soil ability, because this prevents the use of most skills other than attacking. Technically, it also allows the use of items and stuff like that, but the guard action, so it's not the same thing as you can only attack, but it prevents you from using special skills and magic. And so being able to use this to turn off some of those skills from enemies can be very useful. So I just rearranged some of the order of things here mostly. The Ranger, I moved Deft Strike early rather than Keen Eye. Deft Strike is basically power attack. It's the dexterity version of it. So if I go way up here, Deft Strike, yeah. You can see it's slightly more likely to inflict a condition, but it's basically just like, here's 2 times your dex added to your weapon damage. It's just the dexterity version of power attack. The difference is this is more likely to inflict conditions. This is more likely to be a critical hit. So, and one uses dexterity and one uses strength. Obviously, that's another difference. But it's really useful to have this on the Ranger early because it gives you something to do with all of your TP. Because before it's like, okay, I got my TP and nothing to do with it. So having a mixture of TP and non-TP skills is very handy. Similar reasons for moving Death Strike earlier on the Ninja as well. It just gives you something to do with your skills. It gives you something to do with your TP. Antidote I also moved a bit earlier. It was the level 7 skill. I moved it to be the level 3 skill because you want access to this early. Again, a lot of those enemies are inflicting poison, and being able to get rid of it with a skill like this early is very useful. Okay, so the Ninja, I think I moved some stuff around here. I don't remember exactly how that was previously, but I believe Deft Strike is earlier. Probably one of the bigger things I actually did with the Ninja is Phantom Kunai I buffed. So Phantom Kunai, if I go down to the Ninja, I guess I could just use the search function, but this is whatever. So Phantom Kunai, I just tripled its damage. It used to just be your dexterity, and I made it your dex times 3, so it could actually deal reasonable damage. And now this is actually kind of useful because the giant rats are weak to piercing. So if you're using a slashing damage, which you probably are, the giant rats take less damage from that. But this will kill a giant rat in 2 hits near the start of the game. Obviously, it will one-shot them later on, but being able to do that is very, very handy. The Berserker I still need to take a look at. I've not done as much with the Berserker. I don't like Battle Rage as an opening skill like this. And I may actually move these ones later, so that way this can be another unique skill fairly early. I think having both the Whammo and the Berserker start with Opening Strike makes sense just because it's so very useful for what their class does, since their class is heavily TP focused, and it gives them something to do with their energy. It gives them a way to get going earlier on. Battle Rage is an interesting skill. As a reminder, what it does is you pick a target, and then you lose all of your TP to deal damage to that target based on the amount of TP you lost. So Battle Rage is very aggressive against that target, but it's also... it kind of just expends everything, and it leads to this pattern of charge up, expend, and it does a lot of damage very early on, which is very powerful. I may not keep this skill long term, because it's probably going to be very difficult to actually balance against like bosses and stuff, so it's one of those things that's a really interesting idea, but I'm probably going to change it because I think it's just... I'll probably keep the name and everything. It's a great name for this profession, but I don't think I'm going to drain all TP in order to do it. I'll probably structure it some different way, and it might be later. It might be a special MP cost spell that you get later in the game that does damage based on your TP without actually draining it. That's probably what's going to end up happening. Seal Fists is actually a really useful skill, but we're not going to talk about that one right now because I think I've talked about it earlier. So anyway, that's going over a lot of those skill things. Like I said, I still need to take a look at the Berserker. I've been kind of focused on the other ones. So there's a few other things that I came across as I played. First of all, let's do this. Let's load up the game and talk about some of the things that I've run into, because I think that'll be an easier way of going over it rather than me just talking about things. I don't know which classical song was playing there, but so this is the file that I've been playing most recently. So let's just go ahead and grab this. So one of the first things you'll notice is I've added a tree here. You may have noticed it on this screen, but it's very small, so I would be very surprised if you had. So let's go to town. So an early thing that you will notice, if I have the money to rest here, I do not. So an early thing you would notice if I had enough money to rest there is that when I rest, it would then become morning. I can actually... So there's something that I did here. Fireplaces. The fire's warm and comforting. Do you want to pass the time here? You can rest until specific times. This ended up being... the way that I did this is if we go to my day cycles. This theoretically, I want to do something with other, but... So there's a couple of things that I've done here that is really important. One is right here. This is the on-map loaded function. It would set the local tinting, which is just setting what should the tint for the screen look like at this time of day. And it would also turn on the game switch for changing cycles, which I use to do things like music. So this is to say, hey, make sure you're updating things. I've added this line right here because what would happen is when you first start up the game, the value for what the time of day should be is stored in the save file. So if I go here, this right here, because I've added this variable to game system, and then game system gets serialized and saved as part of the save file, this value exists, right? It absolutely exists because it's not null, but it's a local sort of, it's a global variable, but it's a not the state cycle names. Which one right here? Yeah, what time of day you are is stored over here. It's not stored as part of the game system itself, just where you like. So basically think of it as like the clock is saved, but what that clock means is not. Because like I don't necessarily need that. I can derive what time of day or what section of day, night cycle, whatever it is, from the clock, except that I couldn't actually do that. Like, this is the code to do that, but the game system isn't necessarily loaded at this point. So there's ways around that. What I ended up doing is saying, because right here, advanced day cycle, if I just plug 0 in, it goes in here and says, oh, okay, this exists, we're going to add 0 to it, and then we're going to figure out what cycle we are, and if it's a new cycle, we're going to load up the tinting and all that sort of stuff. So what this basically does is this makes it so that way it has the correct... when I call the amount 0, it means that when I first start up the game, it will actually load what the correct time of day is into the variable, and not just have the clock have the correct value. So that was something that's really important. And then I added this advanced day cycle 2, which is what I'm using for resting here. And also, so if I go... This is a common event that I have just copy pasted all over the fireplaces, and I'm gonna make it so that way you can rest at fires, in general principle, in order to advance the day-night cycle however you want, because that may be very useful. We'll get more into that in a moment. But so there's a common event here, rest by the fire. See, advanced day cycle 2, morning or whatever, and then in also has advanced day cycle 2. I really like how these are working out. So the way that works code-wise is it just sets it to the threshold for that day's-night cycle, which is stored in this day cycle states values variable. Morning is... So it actually goes day, evening, night, morning, not morning, day, evening, night. So that might be a little confusing. For the most part, that doesn't really matter or anything. It's just that's how I ended up arranging it, which may be a little non-intuitive, but here we are. So I subtract 1 to get right before, and then I advance 1 step to get into that cycle and set all the changing in place, but you're at the very beginning of the cycle. You can see the comments all say the same thing here, because I literally copied and pasted it and then changed which thing is indexing. But anyway, so that's how that works. Very straightforward function. It does return false if it did not change it. For example, if we want to go to the day cycle that we are in, it won't do anything. So it will return false if, it's not. But it returns true if it changed it. I thought that was going to be useful for this. What I ended up doing instead, because I thought, oh, I can set some code that sets a flag, sets a temporary flag true if I didn't do it or whatever, so that way I could give this message of it's already morning. But what I ended up realizing is it visually works better if I fade out the screen before doing the rest and then fade in the screen, which meant that I had to do the check beforehand. So I just did a script check of if the day cycle is already the one that you're trying to go to, it'll say. So I think right now it's evening. It's already evening. You can't rest till evening. But I can rest till morning, for example. You rest by the fire until morning. And now we've got morning tinting. So this is potentially very useful. Let's just recharge the resurrection segment. Because of an NPC... Oh, cool. Because of an NPC that I have added. Not over here. This NPC just says, oh, hello, if you want something crafted, you should speak with my husband. He's the best. So this guy right here will make stuff for us. Now, you'll notice something. So this is the crafting menu. I don't think you've ever actually seen it before. I originally did not have this comma used by. This tells you how many party members can use this weapon. As you can see, because I realized, hey, none of my party members can use a woodsman's axe or a hunter's bow. That's really important information, though, because I don't want you to make one when you can't actually use it. And you can see down here, I try to point with my fingers as if somehow you can see my finger pointing at bits of the screen. It's not quite how it works. The camera's not oriented the right way for that. But you can see that right here, for example, this costs some hide, some wood, and some feathers. And it allows you to make the hunter's bow. And you can also make the woodsman's axe or a walking stick, which is a club. I'll get into the used by 4 in a moment here because this means that every single party member can use a club. But yeah, so I added that dialogue information because I realized I did not have some way of indicating whether or not you have party members that could use these things. You don't want to craft something that your party members can't use, and you need that information right here, right now when you're going through this. So, this is the crafting menu. Then if we go... How much of my party is going to die to poison? Mishiza is also going to die, but not Icy. Okay, that's fine. I can start resurrecting people. Over here, this house is empty right now. I do want to pass time. I want to pass time until night. Now there's an NPC here. This guy was only here during the night. He has some initial opening dialogue I've already seen, so we're not going to see that here. But you can buy some materials from him. You can buy hide, root, wood, and fang. So this might be useful to you for crafting. These are just some spare materials he has. He will also tell you about the standard monsters you'll find in the area. So you can ask about giant rats, bats, devil hens, buzzkills, and harrowers. And he'll give you some information. So, for example, if we ask about giant bats, he says, "Giant bats, eh? Well, the first thing to know about giant bats is that they only come out at night. As such, I don't see them too often." He spends nights here inside the house. I do know you can sometimes get useful fangs from them, and every now and again a wing will be in good enough shape to use. Most of what I've heard is that they're hard to hit, what with all the flying, and they can smack you real good sometimes. I bet they don't mind the dark or wind either, but given they only show up at night, I'd also bet they don't like light all that much. I hope that helps. So he gives you some information about what enemies might be weak to. So, for example, harrowers. Harrowers, eh? Well, I'd recommend avoiding them. If you have to fight them, I recommend using fire, or at least something slashing. They're weak to fire and slashing damage is the idea here. And forget normal arrows. I hardly do a thing. So this is a really important piece of information. Harrowers are basically immune to piercing damage. They take like 10% from piercing. So you do not want to hit them with piercing damage. So that's why he's talking about this here. I wanted to be very clear. If you're attacking these things with a bow and you're finding you're not doing like any damage, here's why. And so it recommends using a hunter's bow from the Carver. And you can use steel rune arrows with that. I'll show you what that weapon looks like in a moment. Not in-game. None of these characters can use it. And he says those will work. And remember that they're plants. You can't put them to sleep, and they feed on earth, water, and light. And the roots protect them against wind. Of course, they don't much care for ice or lightning. Oh, and I've heard that sometimes they can reflect magic. That's pretty rare, though. Speaking of magic, I know for a fact that they can use sickening soil. Nasty business that'll damage your entire party, and most likely poison them, too. They also know how to use the earth to shield themselves, and if they aren't doing that, they can block attacks and drain away your MP. On the bright side, the roots are useful and always survive the battle, and they're also a good source of wood, usually anyway. So he gives you some very important information about fighting these enemies. Obviously, harrowers have a lot that I wanted the player to be able to know. But if we look at weapons, I've added a few. So we saw these guys right here, right? I've added these weapons. So we have the Woodsman's Axe, which we saw, which has a special skill called Shattering Chop. That's what makes it different from other axes. We have the Walking Stick, which gives you a bit of a boost to your guard effect. So when you're wielding this, you can guard slightly more easily. This is probably a weapon that you're going to get somewhat early just because it's relatively cheap to acquire. I think most weapon acquisition from, like... There's some weapons that and armors that you're going to just straight up buy, but more often you're going to craft things. And then there's the Hunter's Bow, which is a bow that has a special skill, Steel Rune Arrow. So let's go ahead and look at these two skills. The Shattering Chop. So Shattering Chop is just a skill that always removes the Comforting Earth state. It's a heavy swing. It does 20 damage plus your level, so it's not necessarily the most damaging thing. But this is attached to the axe, so while you're wielding the axe, you have access to this skill. It's something that I want to do a lot, actually, is I want to put skills on equipment a lot, because it's a way of adding additional skills to the game that are temporary in a sense, and also because one of the things that I find is Adding a few more options in this way means that it makes you have to choose between weapons in a different sort of way, of like, oh, there's a specific skill that's useful here, I want access to this. It also allows me to compensate for things. So, for example, steel rune arrows, they're pretty straightforward. They cost 10 TP, they give you 10 TP, so you can just constantly use them, but you're not gaining any TP at that point. They have a slightly higher chance to be a critical hit. They have a way better chance of applying conditions, but they just deal standard weapon damage otherwise, but they deal metal damage rather than piercing, which makes them much more useful against plants, because, again, if we go to the Harrower, you'll notice right here, it takes, like, no damage from piercing. So the idea is that if you need to wield a bow, well, this is the bow that you're going to want to use against him, because you can begin using the steel rune arrows that then kind of get through. So yeah, anyway, having skills on equipment allows me to add a few more skills to the game, because gaining access to new abilities is interesting, and it also makes finding new equipment exciting if it might have something useful to use. So that's some of the NPC stuff that I have done. That's the resting by the fire thing. Like I said, if you go to the inn... Yes, thank you. If you go to the inn now, when you rest, it will set it to be morning. It's very similar to the other things that you've seen, so it is what it is. I'm probably going to be removing these things here from this guy's inventory. But I've also added a few other things that I just came to realize would be useful as I played. So if we go here and we take this... I've basically been trying to figure out what does it look like to play without these guys. So actually, let's start by going to the palace, because I added some stuff there. Specifically, I added some stuff to this guy's inventory. So this guy will now sell shields, helmets, plate, armor, gauntlets, and boots. So most of these characters can't equip a lot of this. Devin McElroy can equip a couple of pieces. But this is a place where you can buy some additional armor and weaponry that maybe is beneficial for you to be able to acquire. So he sells surplus royal. Why is this? Oh, it's because this is long enough, it's getting kind of shrunken a little bit. That's why it's not the same width as the other ones. But anyway, so you can buy stuff here. So I've added Kendron equipment. So there's some specific things about this. The shield is the lower end of metal shield guard effects, but it also reduces the rate at which you can be poisoned. The helmet here has a couple, like, it reduces some piercing and slashing damage. The plate reduces the amount of earth damage you take. So it's not quite as good as well at reducing slashing damage as other plate, but it's better at striking and piercing damage reduction. And it also has that earth reduction. This has a pretty good critical boost, but does not boost your dexterity or strength. And these boots also have a bit of reduction to earth damage. Again, Sickening Soil is a spell that the Harrowers use that is earth damage. So if we look at it over here, Sickening Soil is 5 times their earth stat in damage. This hits your party, and being able to reduce earth damage that you are taking is quite beneficial. So that's what that stuff is about. Something else that I've added, hopefully these characters are advanced enough in the Adventurers Guild to show it. But if we go over to the Adventurers Guild, I guess this way is just as good as the other one. But if we go over here and we go upstairs, not downstairs, this person will sell these items. These are slightly cheaper than normal, but they also sell something called a Pot of Healing, which is a special item. It costs 20 gold, which is the same at resting at an inn. It's not quite as good. It only restores half of your HP and MP, and it does not cure you of all of your stats, or all of your ailments or whatever. It just cures you of poison. But being able to go after a battle with Harrowers and be like, okay, we're all at half HP, and we're all poisoned, and being able to just use a pot of healing to get rid of it all at once is very efficient compared to using a bunch of antidotes and healing potions. So this is specifically, like, it cannot be used in battle, as it clearly says. This is not a battle item. This is a clean yourself up after battle item. And we'll see how things could go. I may or may not want to buff it, but I kind of want to incentivize using ins over using pots of healing. But having a pot of healing in your back pocket for after battle is very, very useful. And so I've added this as well. And this person just sells materials. Yeah, that's really all there is to say about them. So that's some stuff in-game, but there's another very important thing to show, which is status. This has been not completely, but largely reconfigured from what is standard. So you'll notice that, I mean, I don't have an example of the standard screen here, but I wanted to add some more stats. This now accommodates all of the item slots that I have. It did not used to. So what I effectively did is I shifted a bunch of stuff around. There was some wasted space up here that was not being used. The portrait was lower, and they had like the name up here, and another one of these like horizontal bars that you can see right here, kind of up there. So I've moved a bunch of stuff around, so that way the character's name is right here, their states go here, their HP and MP are here. It tells you what class they are over here, what their level is, how much experience they currently have, how much they need. Then it gives these stats right here, which it always did, but I've added accuracy and critical rate. It was really important to me to get accuracy on here because this stat is such a determiner of things, being able to see what your accuracy is. Now, the ninja has an inbuilt ludicrous hit rate, but like right now, Isa has 50% accuracy. Knowing that because of the makeshift staff is a really important piece of information. Likewise, this character has lowered accuracy because of the tattered tome. And you can also see the critical rate there. I thought that would be useful to have. So I spent a bunch of time reconfiguring this. You'll also note that it tells you what your currently equipped weapon's damage range is, which is also very useful information to have. So that was a big update that I did. That's a whole section of code. If we go in here, we go... not this file. This is the wrong file. If we go to AC modification, we go down here, we have the end status screen block. So there's a whole block of stuff here where I had to do a bunch of stuff to modify what it's drawing and how and where, and rearrange all sorts of stuff and figure out, okay, how do I want to draw the actor's face, their name, their class, stuff with their basic information and their equipment and parameters, and adding the things for drawing accuracy and critical hit rate, or critical rate rather. Moving all this around and adding the level here as opposed to how it was being drawn normally. This is a very, very different screen. Most of this is pretty straightforward. I did need to do this modified draw weapon name function right here that you can see. That basically is a copy of the draw item function, except specifically for weapons, that adds this bit here for evaluating damage. Again, all of that. Plus, if you don't have a weapon equipped, it will just tell you your fists deal this amount of damage. So if I were to go in here, and I were to go to, I don't know, this guy, and I were like, you don't need this staff, and I were to go to status on him, it'd say fists 5 to 15. So that way you know, oh, this is how much my fists would deal. Not very much. This character doesn't have much strength. But anyway, it will do that as well to give you that bit of info if you ever want it, I guess. So yeah, doing this was a lot of kind of mucking about and a lot of trial and error to get it where I wanted. I also added these functions right here. Buff party will grab the game party and iterate through it and apply a buff to all of your party members. This is how I do the thing on the leader strike. It has this buff party function it can reference, which does that. I probably should modify this so that way instead of doing party, it does this same sort of thing as like heal allies does, or splash damage. Splash damage is probably going to be need to be modified as well. It doesn't hit the target, but there's other things it kind of ignores. This ignores your sort of damage multiplier for type and all that sort of stuff. It doesn't have a type attached to it. So I'll probably need to make this more complicated in some way to make it function properly. But I like the idea of adding these functions. There are things that I can do. So this gets your target's friends, units, members, and iterates over them and has them take damage. Heal allies is a little bit more straightforward and useful. This will also ignore type modifiers. So if you gain more health from life health because you're weak to life, it's going to ignore that, but that's okay. So that's some significant stuff there. Is that most of the stuff that's obvious in game? I think so. I'll go ahead and just drop a save on this file and close that for now. Start up this music. I don't know where we're at there, but it's very quiet. Yes, okay, I can vaguely hear something. So one of the other enormous things that I did, and the eagle-eyed among you may have spotted it, it's the equipment use planning thing. So, the backstory of this enormous spreadsheet is that I realized as I was going through, scrolling through with my full party testing stuff, that, or as I was doing different configurations, that a lot of weapons really weren't able to be used by very many characters. So obviously you cannot see the before, but take my word for it, at least half, if not more, of this was in this sort of coloration where it's like 3 or fewer characters could actually make use of it. So this was a huge problem. I wanted to be able to track like equipment usage and how much various types of things were being used. And a lot of the armors were doing pretty fine, especially things like the feet and the arms, which have a fairly limited quantity. A lot of the accessory usage was fine levels. I did do some tweaks to things here. So, for example, I allowed the ranger to be able to wield the comb or use the comb as well, because it gives you a chance to apply conditions, which is thematically fitting for the ninja, but also for the ranger. So I wanted the ranger to be able to use it. Obviously, the sage can use everything. That's part of their gimmick. But a lot of the weapons were being able to be used by 2 to 3 people, not at least 4, and I wanted at least 4. The reason for that is because, I mean, it means that at least a quarter of the various individuals could make use of it. As you can see, 4 is 28.57% usage. 3 is less than that. So this just counts the X's in the row. And then this is that divided by 14. As formatted as a percentage. So, it makes it very difficult to add early game equipment if a lot of characters are unable to wield specific weapons, and it also, in general, can make some of the stuff less rewarding if you're getting a bunch of weapons you can't use. That's why it's so important that I'm very careful on how much rewards are weapon-based as opposed to materials that you can use to craft weapons-based. Because if I'm like, oh, you got this really sweet sword, but it's like, none of my characters can wield swords. As you can see, most of the characters can't. Only 35, almost 36% can actually use swords. Most characters cannot use swords. So if you are... I mean, nine of the characters cannot use swords. So if I give you a sweet sword and you've made a party entirely of people who cannot use swords, which is not unlikely, then it's a really lame reward. If instead I give you a rare crafting material or a whole bunch of a crafting material or something, that can then allow you to be able to be like, oh, I can finally make that piece of armor I want, or I can finally make that really sweet weapon, or things like that. So it gives me a lot more versatility if I'm focused on more crafting cool equipment rather than giving you cool equipment. I'll still give you some here and there, but more likely it's going to be in these categories of equipment, because it's much more likely that you will have a character that can make use of it if I give you, say, a tunic, or... Because, like, a tunic is used by 6 characters, right? It's still possible to make a party that doesn't use it. But especially something like if I give you sweet shoes, or if I give you a nice focus, it's literally impossible to make a party where somebody cannot use a focus, right? Or cannot wear shoes. You can have only one person that can use shoes, or you know, but half your party at least has to be able to use a focus. So those sorts of things are really good choices, or rings and necklaces are good choices of rewards to give you, because it's more likely that you'll be able to use them, as opposed to giving you something like, what is this, full helmet. Most characters cannot use a full helmet. Not as good of a reward. Much better to give you materials and let you craft stuff. So I'm definitely going to have an emphasis on crafting stuff. I'm going to need to make sure that most things can be salvaged as well, because that allows you to be able to get materials to be able to craft things. The salvaging, I haven't added an NPC that can salvage stuff yet. That's something that's going to be kind of available in general areas, but it breaks stuff down into some constituent material. And so being able to do that, being able to salvage things, is immensely useful for being able to, say, take a bum reward and make use of it, because, you know, it was previously something that wasn't very good. So there's a number of things that I've just kind of like added on to a lot of the characters. One of the things that you'll notice is that the club is now usable by everyone. It used to be wieldable by like 2 or 3. I'm like, a club is a very straightforward weapon. I want everybody to be able to make use of it, and I want it to be something that can be kind of like a reliable, straightforward weapon that anybody can use. Most characters can't use it very well because it scales with your strength, but never mind that. So clubs. They are usable by everyone, and that was something that I added. But if we go through most weapons, like not the dagger, and I think the sword was in a good spot too, but a lot of weapons I added stuff to. So like flail, I added the ability for the berserker to use that. Did I need to do anything with axe? I think the axe was okay. The whip previously was only able to be used by the telenergist and the sage, so that was pretty terrible. I added it to the ranger and the ninja as something that they could use as well. Staff was in a fine spot because most of the casting professions could use it. I added bow use to the whammo. The whammo originally could not use a bow, and I added that. The crossbow originally could only be used by like the knight and the sage, and I added it to the war mage and the blizzagus to give a little bit more usage. I also allowed the special forces and the warlock to use the flintlock. Before it was only the ninja and the sage. Both of these guys have affinity for guns, so I've added it to them as well. The claws I also added to the warlock. Gloves I added to the war mage and special forces. They seemed like things that they might use as well. Before, again, it was a bit more limited. Even the spear, I think I added the spear to the whammo and the prismage, or was it the prismage that I gave it to? Previously, the spear was not used by enough characters. The mace also needed to be added to somebody. I added it to the blizzagus. I don't remember. I did not set this up to make it easy to remember who I added things to, but that I increased usage. I think the scepter was okay. Again, the club I added to more people. The chain, I think, had previously been okay. I wanted basically everything to be wieldable by at least 4 characters. I think this one had been fine as well. The pipe I added to the knight. The knight did not originally was not originally able to use the pipe. I added that there. The slingshot I added to the whammo. Before it was just the druid, ninja, and sage that could use it. Shotgun I added to the prismage. They're allowed to use shotguns now. Whereas the rifle I added to the telenergist. The telenergist is now allowed to use the rifle. And the warlock is able to use both of those as previously was the case. The chainsaw I also added. So it was originally like Special Forces Berserker and Sage. I added it to the Knight as something that they could use. I added Magic Missile to the whammo. I decided the whammo should be able to use Magic Missile. Stun Rod I added to the Sorcerer. Stun Rods deal lightning damage to the Sorcerer's specialty is lightning. It seemed like a good fit. I also gave it to the Special Forces. As you can tell, it was not used by very many. The Katana I added to the Blizzagus. It was originally Ranger, Ninja, and Sage only. So I added it to the Blizzagus here. I think Tomes were okay. That's a caster weapon, so it was on a couple of different characters. Scythe was originally, I think... Yeah, it was War Mage, Druid, and Sage that could use it. I added it to the Ranger. And Scimitar was previously usable by like almost no one. So I added it to all of the casters. All of the casters or like MP casters. I didn't give it to the Whammo, the Berserker, obviously. But I gave it to the Telenologist, Prismage, Sorcerer, Warmage, Blizzagus. Because before it was only like the Blizzagus and the Sage that could use it. The Druid and the Warlock, of course the Sage can use it. So I dramatically increased the number of weapon options that characters have available to them. So if we actually go over to the classes, we can see which ones I added. So you can see like, the club. So basically if like it's after the club, it's probably was added. So club, pipe, and chainsaw. Whammo got access to the club, bow, spear, slingshot, and magic missile. So the Whammo before was very limited in what weapons they could use. It was basically like the sword, mace, and axe. So I added a bunch of weapons that they could use. The Telenologist was like whip, staff, scepter. So I added club, rifle, and scimitar. The Prismage, again, was very limited, and I added a bunch of weapons for them to use. The club, spear, shotgun, and scimitar. Sorcerer, again, this is useful to see, right? Dagger, staff, magic missile, and tome. I added club, stun rod, and scimitar, so you can see, like, having more weapon options just gives a lot more options in terms of what you're doing. The Warmage originally had a better list than some, but I added the club, crossbow, gloves, and scimitar. Blizzagus was also very limited. Staff, chain, and scimitar was all they could use before. I added club, crossbow, mace, and katana. The Warlock had a very different set, so they're energy sword, shotgun, rifle, stun rod, and tome. I added club, flintlock, claws, and scimitar. Druid doesn't even use bows very well, but staff, bow. They originally could wield club, so that's not an addition. The only addition that they got is the scimitar, but I believe. But their weapon things was originally a bit of a shorter list. Why they could use clubs, I don't know, but I decided on it. Special Forces added a few more: the club, flintlock, gloves, and stun rod. Ranger, I don't think got Ranger got a couple: club, whip, and scythe. But already had a decent selection of things. A lot of the physical attackers I added a bunch of weapons to. You can see just the club and the whip here for the ninja. And, of course, here we have the flail getting added to the Berserker's list of weapons that they could use. So I just found that what weapons could be used was a bit too small. And I really wanted to do an assessment of that to figure out, okay, how is my weapon usage? How is that looking? How's my equipment usage? And it felt like everything was a bit too small. So this was a big undertaking of like filling all this out and then kind of figuring out, okay, where are things? Where do I want them to be? All that sort of stuff. So, yeah, just kind of scanning through these things at the bottom here. I think that's a lot of the stuff there. Like I said, I spent a bunch of time, and we're already pretty long in the video, so that is what it is. I spent a bunch of time playtesting and figuring out various things that felt like they could go better or be more interesting or weren't playing super well. One of the other things actually that I had on camera for a moment, so let's go back to it, but then kind of didn't talk about, is I actually went into the enemies, and you'll notice that these are now dealing, instead of just dealing raw values for their damage, they're now dealing damage based on their stats. This specifically is something that I added so that way things that modify enemy stats would actually modify their damage. So they will deal, like if you get an earth down on the Harrower, it will deal less damage, like all around, but it'll deal less damage with its attack specifically. Or like if you take a bite out of a Buzzkill's dexterity, for example, it will dramatically decrease how much damage it can deal to you. Devil Hens have a real nasty crit. But you can see, like, lowering their strength and dex. And if you're wondering, the stages, I actually like how they do the stages a little bit better in Pokemon. Pokemon stages use a multiplier of, like, base 2/2, and if you decrease, it's incrementing the denominator, and if you increase, it's incrementing the numerator. So, like, if you are negative state in Pokemon, it drops it from 2/2 to 2/3, and then 2/4, which is 1/2, and then 2/5, which is down to 40%, and then like 2/6, which is 1/3. So it kind of slides it. Whereas if you're increasing, it goes up to 3/2, which is 50% more. It's 1.5. And then 4/2, which is 2 times. 5/2. So like because of that, it's the increases are a lot more raw powerful than the decreases. What this system does by default is it caps at 2 stages, not 6, which Pokemon caps at 6. But it will go by 25% increments. So negative 1 stage is minus 25% to your stat, and then minus 50%. Positive is plus 25%, plus 50%. So it definitely has an impact on things, and I wanted to be able to influence damage and stuff here. So that's what I've made sure happens. I think that covers a lot of it. I have started working over here on this map. This is going to be some sort of early game dungeon-y area. I mean, it's going to be a one-map dungeon-y area, but this is supposed to be an area where you can find loot and fight things. Because one of the things that I've found as I've been playing and playtesting is just wandering around the map, waiting for random encounters to happen, and then fighting those is okay, but it's not very rewarding. It's not the most fun thing. The fights are not like awful or anything, and it is fun to watch your character get stronger. But I wanted an area to actually explore, because it's walking around the same spot in the world map gets a little tedious, a little boring. It's the random battles are fine as a backdrop to exploration, but they are not fine as the main thing that you are doing, with no particular goal in mind. So I will say the bounties are really useful for boosting your gold rewards and making the random encounters more rewarding, but particularly in this area where the enemies have limited drops. Oh, there's another thing that I've actually started adding to. This map obviously is not much of anything yet, although I will show you where it is. It's right here where this tree is. I don't have a good way of representing a clearing on the map, so I've just put this big tree here. That's why the entrances are on the bottom and the left side. You can't enter the mountain directions. But this is theoretically going to be a very early game dungeon. Okay, like I said, there's another thing that I've been adding. So you can see here's the pot of healing. But if we go all the way down here, we have food. I do intend to have cooking in the game. These don't do anything yet. I've not priced them. I've just made them. So we have tomato, bell pepper, lettuce, herbs, basil, because this looks like basil to me. Bottle of water, salt, sausage, cherries, berries, cheese, egg, olives. This basically is like, this is definitely an egg, and these look like eggs, but I don't want monster egg or something like that. So this is just egg. And then this is like, this kind of looks like olives. Olives are useful, primarily for oil, but I like olive oil. I don't actually like eating olives. But this seems like a reasonable food to have. Bread, apple, grapes, orange, nuts, mushroom, fish, meat, potatoes, good old meat and potatoes, an onion and carrot. So there is one more icon in the sort of like food category, which is this guy. I'm going to specifically use this for meals. Like, you cannot craft with this food items, and eating it will provide you some sort of buff that lasts long term, like 1,000 steps or 2,000 steps or something. That has some sort of small effect, like increasing TP gain or, I don't know, whatever random things. I do intend for eating each one of these ingredients to have some sort of minor effect, probably a much shorter duration. It's better to actually cook things for the most part than to eat food raw, and you cannot eat food in combat, but I do plan to have a cooking system because they gave me a bunch of food icons, so here we are. So I added those in preparation for all of that. That whole process. I think that covers most of what's going on at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and close here. Like I said, lots of stuff happening, a lot of good information from playtesting, and I'm beginning to flesh out some of that early game experience. I'm started adding some NPCs to this town for you to interact with, and particularly like that information hunter and stuff like that. I added the whole thing with fire, where you can rest at it and all of those systems, and so lots of little things. And yeah, playtesting is a very valuable source of information and motivation, so that's good for me to remember. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. So thank you all very much for watching, and until next time, take care, everyone, and goodbye.